Mick, maybe you could introduce yourself and the Global Leaders team.
My name is Mick Dillon. I'm the co-portfolio manager on the Global Leaders strategy with Bertie Thompson. We've been doing it together for just over 8 years now. We work with all of the brand analysts, all the sector specialists and the fundamental analysts. So it's a big team with a very core focused group on the strategy.
And I guess one good place to start is why invest in a global portfolio?
One of the beauties of a global investment universe is that you get to invest in lots of different businesses that have different drivers. Of course, that means that we invest in the US and Europe, but then we can go and find companies in Indonesia who are doing something really unique and special for their customers, or Brazil or other countries as well. And those non-correlated returns can be really additive to the portfolio. And so, as an example, in Global Leaders, roughly half of our alpha over time has come from the US, which has been very strong for the last 8 years. But about half has also come from non-US markets. And so that global portfolio gives you a better, we believe, opportunity set to find more differentiated outcomes in the portfolio.
And Mick, maybe you can give us an overview of the Global Leaders approach.
The number one thing we look for is companies that really help their customers, that solve a problem for their customers. And in that way, the customers want to work with them over a really long period of time. And it's important because the customers are the ultimate decider of who wins in the marketplace and who generates economics for their shareholders. So everything starts with the customer. But then I've touched on, we want sustainable business advantages to compound a competitive advantage. We look for companies ultimately that are going to deliver high returns on capital for the shareholders. And for us, we look for a minimum 20% return on invested capital. So there's a lot of overarching tenets that we look for in the strategy, but one that's really important is valuation. We have to buy these things cheap so that they can compound the economics over time and deliver for our investors too. And so for us, when we look at these companies, we're not just looking on a short-term basis, everything is over very long periods of time.
And Mick, what makes for a global leader?
Yes, this is the fun bit of the job. I mean, it's all fun, but this is the really fun bit because you're sitting there with, to your question before, 10,000 potential companies around the world, minimum, that we could go and invest in. How do we go and find the 30 or 40 that we invest in? We use 4 tests to differentiate what are the truly great companies that we want to invest in versus some of the 10,000 companies that we could invest in out there. Our first test is what we call franchise quality. Is this a great business? And the number one step is start with the customer. What does this company do for its customer that nobody else can do? That identifies unique businesses. The second big test that we use is quantitative metrics. In other words, yes, we know what it's doing for the customer, but can we see it in the numbers? Have we got a 20% return on capital? Is this a company that's differentiated versus its peers numerically as well? The third test is management quality. This is about management teams and companies that can reinvest the profits and the capital from their businesses to solve future problems for their customers as well. We find that family-run businesses, founders, and in particular management teams that have been there for a long time, really are able to think about a different time horizon and therefore consequently invest in a much better way for their customers. The last test for us is valuation. We look for double-digit annual returns. And when we get that over 5, but in particular 7 years, that means we'll have doubled our investors' money. And over any 7-year period, that's a great outcome for our investors.
And thinking about how clients typically use the strategy in terms of asset allocation, how does it fit alongside other global managers?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because we think of ourselves as very high quality. We think of ourselves as quite defensive. We aim to outperform in downturns and protect people's money. But actually, it's quite interesting when we get looked at versus other typical high quality managers, we're actually quite different. We have a number of investments in financials and they're really interesting companies. They're doing, I talked about Indonesia before, micro-lending in Indonesia, or helping run the capital infrastructure of Brazil or other countries. So that financial market infrastructure is really important. And we can find these great companies out there who do this and solve people's problems. What makes it really interesting for us is that when the asset allocators look at our strategy, often it performs when other strategies don't, and which is really helpful because they can use it in 2 ways. One is they can use it in that expectation of it's a defensive portfolio because it's very high quality. The other is we often get paired with either other growth managers or other quality managers because we perform at a different time. And so there's two ways that the strategy typically gets used.
And I also want to ask you about sustainability. How do you think about these areas?
I'll start with the positive. We've been very lucky. Brown has a very long history of investing in sustainability, and we use a framework that has been developed called Sustainable Business Advantages. And those SBA drivers, as we call them, were actually first created in our US large cap sustainable growth strategy, and we've adopted it into global leaders. It looks at how are you using sustainability to drive revenues, to cut costs, either for yourself or for your customers, or to enhance your franchise value. In other words, create economic value in one of multiple ways. Every business has risks, and you've got to make sure they're managing them in an appropriate way for the long run. So our framework is to incorporate it. I think of it in a really shortcut way is, how are you using, in particular, either the social side or the environmental side to compound a competitive advantage? In other words, differentiate you versus peers to create customer value.
And the global sector is a busy space. How do you think you really stand out versus your peers?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There's probably two ways. One is around the customer focus that we've touched on, and another is around behavioral investing. I'll start with the customer focus. I've described what we're looking for in terms of we want a great customer outcome because it helps the customer. But actually, that means that we need to go and talk to the customers. We have an investigative team of analysts whose job is to go out and do customer surveys, to talk to the customers and get into the mind of the customer and understand, quite frankly, why they come back, why are they paying for value, and why are they here? And ultimately, will they be around for the long run? That investigative team we think is quite unique, and that customer mindset mentality is also very rare. The second part is in behavioral economics. We work with a coach, and the coach's job is to help us in particular in capital allocation. So thinking about the portfolio manager's job, which is how do I buy, how do I size the positions, and when do I sell? And we work with our coach to sit down and analyze all of those skills. Just like every sporting team works with the coach, you need data and analytics and decision-making under uncertainty, but the goal is always to try and get better. And so our coach's job is to bring to life behavioral economics in a practical, applied way into the portfolio.
And Mick, how does the global leaders strategy evolve in differing market conditions or economic environments?
Oh, this is a really important question, because one of the things that we think about is, does this issue matter in 5 years' time? And time for us is our biggest opportunity, and being able to abstract yourself from the short term to think about how are you creating value for the customers, and is this going to matter in 5 years' time? And so for us, we really think of ourselves as applied microeconomists. We're fundamental bottom-up investors. We're looking at how these things create value today and in the future, but do the macroeconomic forces matter over time? Most of the time, as humans, we adapt, we adjust, we get better, we learn, and we can then overcome of most of the short-term issues that we see and look to the long term.
And finally, before we wrap up, maybe you could give us a bit of insight into yourself as an investor. Tell us something that nobody knows.
I grew up on a farm in the middle of outback Australia. And as with a lot of investors, you get the bug when you're a child. But for me, it was a very different way around, because I was in a business and we were always sitting there talking about, crop utilization or maximization of the yield, or how we could improve our growing process, or there was always something that we could get better. There was something we could improve. There was learning to be had. And actually, that's all the same as exactly what Bertie and I do today in Global Leaders, is how can we make our processes better and how can we improve? But the real joy, back to starting as a kid, is just looking at different businesses and understanding it, but then taking that learning and applying it in a way to create value for others. For me, it's been a terrific journey, but I started in a very, very different place. Every single day, I love getting out of bed, just going to learn and then working out how we can use that.